Hey, welcome back to the stash.
Every comic book character has an era that defines them. An era that doesn't just move the story forward, but forces the hero to confront everything they're afraid to face. For Spider-Man though, I think it's a little more complicated, because in my opinion, each era has their say. The early days with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, polished era of John Romita Sr., the incredible 1980s, it's all very important to the character, or just being good comic books in general. But one era that particularly sticks out as a time that truly helped to define the Amazing Spider-Man has got to be Gerry Conway's run. It's an era that begins in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 111 and ends in issue 149 with a handful of tie-in issues around it. This era represents something different. It feels like a time that still had the echoes of the Silver Age coursing throughout each page, while still evolving into the more mature and in-depth storytelling that filled the 80s. It's the moment where the Amazing Spider-Man comics stopped being about a teenager balancing university and responsibility, and started being about a young adult who has to deal with grief, loss, trauma, friendship breakdowns, and the consequences of every choice he makes. When Conway takes over the title at just 19 years old, Marvel is transitioning out of the 1960s and into a new generation of storytelling. The Lee Romita era built the mythology, but Conway is the one who shakes it to its foundation. He introduces characters who will change the franchise, he pushes legacy characters into darker territory, he breaks Peter Parker emotionally and rebuilds him issue by issue. So, for today, I want to take a look at one of my favorite eras of Spider-Man comics, the Gerry Conway era. We're going through the run's massive turning points and the emotional movements that define everything he created, because Conway's run is a special type of journey, one that changed the Amazing Spider-Man forever. But hey, real quick, here at the Stash, we're swinging for 25,000 subscribers. Now that's a tall order, I know, but with great power comes great responsibility. And all you gotta do is click subscribe. So if you're into Spider-Man or just comic book deep dives, feel free to stick around. Also, be sure to stay at the very end for another episode of Comics from the Stash. This time, I'll be going over some of my key issues from the Gerry Conway run of The Amazing Spider-Man. And just a little hint, there is some major keys involved. But with that all said, let's get right back into the video. When Gerry Conway takes over with The Amazing Spider-Man issue 111, the series is at a fascinating transitional moment. Stan Lee had stepped away from the book, Roy Thomas did a few stories right after, and Marvel was beginning to trust younger writers who could inject new ideas into their flagship titles. Conway, despite being barely out of his teens, brings a tone that is instantly different from the early 60s issues. His opening comics actually focus heavily on the shifting emotional state of Peter Parker's life. Peter is no longer the high school kid Ditko introduced. He's not even the optimistic college student Romita inherited. He's a young man now. Someone who has to manage work, relationships, financial stress, and the growing complexity of being Spider-Man. Now, that's not to say that wasn't present before, because it certainly was, only Conway exemplified it tenfold. The very early Conway issues continue with the introduction of villains like the Gibbon and reintroduce enemies like Kraven the Hunter. But the external conflict isn't the real centerpiece. For me, the emotional core is Harry Osborn. There's a real sense of Harry's growing instability across these issues. His drug misuse from the earlier stories carries into Conway's run, and the tension between him and Peter escalates dramatically. Harry becomes more irritable, paranoid, and distant, and the foundation of their friendship starts to crack. And Peter tries to ignore these warning signs. He tries to stay focused on Gwen Stacy, his studies, Aunt May's ongoing involvement with Dr. Octopus, and his growing responsibilities, but Conway doesn't allow the story to be about balance. In fact, I think he does the opposite. Even from the covers alone, there's a real sense of chaos within these early issues, and I just love that. It's non-stop Spidey goodness, and no matter which issue you pick up, you can't help but feel enticed by what's inside from just the cover. Now, in the Amazing Spider-Man issues 116 to 118, Conway adapts the incredible Spectacular Spider-Man magazine story by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. It creates a citywide political corruption arc involving the villainous politician Richard Ray Lee. This storyline, although being largely Lee and Romita's work, gives still a good preview of Conway's large-scale tone with chaos paired with deeply personal stakes. Spider-Man is being overwhelmed by a world that refuses to slow down, and so by the time Conway reaches the Amazing Spider-Man issue 121, everything is in place for one of the most defining tragedies in all of comics. Norman Osborn regains his memories of being the Green Goblin after a series of personal failures and emotional triggers. His anger towards Peter resurfaces. His knowledge of Peter's identity comes back, so he kidnaps Gwen Stacy and brings her to the George Washington Bridge. Peter arrives and the battle commences. The two go back and forth until Gwen is knocked off the bridge. Peter goes to save her. He believes he did, but he didn't. Gwen Stacy died, and now nothing will be able to stop Spider-Man from going after the Green Goblin. I adore how the issue focuses on Peter's emotional collapse, from the shock to the denial to the violent outburst he curses at the Goblin. It all takes us perfectly to the Amazing Spider-Man issue 122. Peter, now consumed by grief and rage, hunts down the Green Goblin. The issue shows the emotional toll of everything Peter has gone through. Every choice, sacrifice, and moment where being Spider-Man has cost him something real and dear to his heart. And so throughout the comic, we see a rare side of Peter. One that leaves his desperate friends to the voices of their own twisted mind. One whose eyes look fierce with revenge, and an attitude that properly means business. But of course, the comic famously ends with the death of Norman Osborn. The two battle viciously until the glider impales the Green Goblin. This was Norman Osborn's first canonical death, and with it came long repercussions for Harry Osborn, the Osborn legacy, and Spider-Man's world as a whole. I actually wish he stayed dead. I think the effects it had on the comics were brilliant, and it set up so many good moments in later issues that to me are just so iconic. Like this page from Spectacular Spider-Man, I'll never get over. I just wish that we had this adapted, even if it was in like the Spectacular Spider-Man show. It would have been such a brilliant scene. But it doesn't end there, because Harry Osborn, the son of the Green Goblin, discovers his father's fate and the secret base he once had. This becomes the emotional anchor for everything Conway does in the next few stories. Conway's first major movement ends with Peter Parker completely broken. His girlfriend is dead, his best friend is spiraling into mental collapse, he's responsible for the death of the Green Goblin, and his life has been irreversibly changed. This is the fall. This is the point where Peter Parker's world shatters, and Conway is just getting started. After Gwen's death, Conway could have moved on quickly, but to the benefit of the series, he refused to. Conway dedicates the next series of issues to exploring the emotional fallout in large detail, and I think the way he handled it was great. For Peter, it affected him deeply. He could never quite think straight, and even the slightest resemblance of Gwen Stacy would send him spiraling. Peter, after Gwen's death, tries to process what happened, but he can't. He throws himself deeper into the role as Spider-Man, believing that non-stop action will distract him from the pain, but instead it only further isolates him. With that though came the seed of his future, because within the pages of The Night Gwen Stacy Died, Mary Jane Watson puts aside her usual party girl persona. She puts aside her fear, and instead faces them head on with Peter Parker. Mary Jane Watson becomes increasingly important in this stretch of the run. MJ begins appearing more frequently, revealing a rather compassionate, grounded side of her personality. Conway starts guiding her away from the carefree archetype of earlier issues, and towards the emotional depth she'll be eventually known for. This era lays the foundation for their future, even though the transformation isn't instant. But as Peter tries to move forward, the world keeps pushing back. Harry Osborn, devastated by his father's death, becomes more unstable, and with Harry's increasing paranoia, resentment, and detachment, his mental health deteriorates issue by issue. Conway builds Harry as a mirror to Peter, two young men traumatized by the actions of one man. And so during this mid-run stretch, Conway leans into the unique blend of street-level drama and bizarre 1970s experimental storytelling. In the Amazing Spider-Man issues 124 to 125, he introduces Man-Wolf, tying John Jameson's transformation to a mystical gem on the moon. This story blends sci-fi, horror, and character drama, while giving J. Jonah Jameson one of his most emotionally complex arcs as he fears for his son. Then comes the Mindworm in ASM issue 138, a psychic villain representing psychological manipulation. I actually think this story is super underrated. I've had this issue since forever though. I remember my dad and I got it way back when in our local comic store. There was something about the cover that just, unnerved me a little as a kid. But when I finally read it as I got older, I understood the story properly and I thought it was a really great read. Conway also introduces the Tarantula in ASM issues 134 and 135, marking the debut of one of Spider-Man's classic mercenary foes. These issues expand Peter's world in a broader, more politically charged landscape, with Tarantula representing a grounded threat in contrast to the more supernatural villains. But the centerpiece of this era, and one of Conway's most influential contributions to the Marvel Universe, arrives in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 129. This is the first appearance of the Punisher and the Jackal. The Punisher is introduced as a vigilante manipulated by the Jackal into hunting Spider-Man, believing him to be a murderer. This marks the beginning of one of Marvel's most important characters, whose violent and uncompromising methods contrast starkly with Peter's values. The Jackal, on the other hand, has a more subtle involvement at first. During this time, he usually lurked in the shadows, manipulating events without revealing his full motivations, and so he plays this long game that eventually pays off dramatically in the final act of Conway's run. Through all these weird storylines, crime thrillers, sci-fi experiments, emotional character drama, Peter Parker is just trying to survive. He's trying to keep his life together, even as every issue threatens to pull it apart. This chapter is about momentum, about movement without fully healing, about a character who keeps swinging forward because stopping means confronting the pain he's terrified to face. The final part of Gerry Conway's run is its boldest and most emotionally devastating. Beginning with the Amazing Spider-Man issue 136, everything Conway has been building, Harry's mental decline, the Jackal's manipulation, Peter's unresolved grief, it all comes to the surface. In ASM 136, Harry Osborn fully becomes the new Green Goblin. And my god, isn't this cover just so good? This transformation is the conclusion of the downward spiral Conway crafted over the last 20 issues. Harry's anger towards Peter intensifies, his grief twists into hatred, his obsession with the Goblin legacy becomes overwhelming, and just like his father, Harry's attacks are personal. Conway nailed it when it comes to Harry as the Goblin, because he depicted everything so insanely real and human. This is a broken young man taking aim at the person he once called his best friend. And that emotion lingers throughout the story, and sets up an incredible one in the future that is easily one of my favorite arcs in Spider-Man history. Peter tries to navigate this new threat while still juggling everything. He's emotionally exhausted, but he keeps going. Simultaneously, the Jackal steps out of the shadows. Warren's obsession with Gwen Stacy has grown into something twisted and something very dangerous, and his grief becomes the catalyst for one of the most iconic and controversial storylines in Spider-Man's entire history. Amazing Spider-Man issue 144 has Peter encounter someone he is completely unprepared to face. Gwen Stacy, or someone who looks exactly like her. This, as you could probably guess, is a Gwen Stacy clone, created by the Jackal using advanced science and genetic technology. The revelation devastates Peter. It forces him to confront everything he has been running from since issue 121, and a part of him snaps a little when the shock and realization hits him. As the story escalates though, the Jackal manipulates Peter's guilt and grief, pushing him towards emotional collapse. All of this reaches its climax in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 149. This issue is the emotional release Conway has been building toward since Gwen's death in ASM 121. Now, the Amazing Spider-Man issue 149 is Conway's final issue on the title, and while Archie Goodwin finishes off the story, Conway still went out with an incredible bang. He left Spider-Man at a crossroads. He's grieving, but he's alive. He was broken, but now he's recovering, and most importantly, he's quietly reconnecting with Mary Jane as the earliest seeds of their future relationship begin to form. Conway's final movement is about closure, about confronting the past, about reclaiming identity. This is where Peter Parker finally begins to heal. Gerry Conway's Spider-Man run at its best is the emotional spine of Spider-Man's modern identity, because across the Amazing Spider-Man issues 111 to 149, Conway reshapes the character in so many permanent ways. Gwen Stacy's death becomes the defining tragedy of Peter's life for a very long time. Harry Osborn's fall into madness becomes one of the most personal villain arcs in comics and sets up future incredible stories, the first Punisher appearance changes Marvel's entire landscape, the Jackal introduces cloning and psychological manipulation, the Gwen clone forces Peter to confront trauma instead of running from it, and Peter and MJ begin a quiet, genuine emotional foundation. And I think the storytelling itself shifts from youthful adventure to adult drama. Conway took over as the writer for ASM and made it his own. He truly redefined Spider-Man. This era tears Peter Parker down. It tests his values, it forces him to face grief, responsibility, guilt, friendship, and identity, but it also shows him slowly building himself back up. This is the run that breaks him, shapes him, and ultimately saves him. This is Gerry Conway's legacy, and in my opinion, it remains one of the most important eras in Spider-Man's history.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Comics from the Stash, and I am still sick. I'm doing a little bit better, but I do apologize if you could hear the sickness in the video. I really want to get this one out, and I just try to push through the recording. And yeah, I can finally wear the mask again. I'm not fearing sneezing in it, which I was before, which is a good thing. But let's get right into it. So I do have every issue of Gerry Conway's run of The Amazing Spider-Man, but these are the main keys. So to start off with, we have The Amazing Spider-Man issue 113, the first appearance of Hammerhead. Then we have issue 119, which begins the Hulk story. Very cool story. I love the artwork here. Then we got a big one. This one took me forever to find. I had to get it from, I believe, America. I didn't go there to order it from eBay, but it just took me forever to find this one. It is issue 121, The Death of Gwen Stacy. Then going right after that, we have issue 122, The Death of the Green Goblin. I actually have two copies of this one. The second copy I found was at my local comic store. They had it for like $10, so I immediately just bought another copy. It is issue 124, the first appearance of the Man-Wolf. Now this is the biggest key. It is one of the biggest keys in general for Spidey. Very good condition as well. It is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 129, the first appearance of the Jackal and the Punisher. Then we got issue 134, who has a pretty interesting first appearance, a very underrated character in my opinion. It is the first appearance of the Tarantula. Now, I love this cover a lot. It's probably, probably my favorite one of the bunch. It is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 136, the first appearance of Harry Osborn as the Green Goblin. Then we got issue 144, which is the first appearance of Gwen Stacy's clone. And then to end this one off, we have The Amazing Spider-Man issue 149, the first appearance of Ben Reilly. But that has been it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, because here, any support means so much. And yeah, thank you guys again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.